How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to be covering the patch 14.10 top lane tier list. Now my goal for this video is to make a general tier list that can apply for all elo brackets, but there are definitely going to be some variables depending on which rank you're in. So I'll be doing my best along the way to explain if this champion should be higher or lower depending on which rank they're in, and I will be timestamping every champion down below, so feel free to skip to your favorite champion. Hey everyone, if you're passionate about improving and leveling up your gameplay, I've been offering coaching classes for 5 days a week for quite some time, and just seen firsthand how much my students have been improving across all different elo brackets. How it works is you'll come to a class with a VOD you like reviewed, and I'm going to help you with your early game, your mid game, or anything you feel like needs improving. And if you're unsure, then I'm going to steer you in the right direction by setting clear learning objectives. Link's going to be in the description, I hope to see you there, but if not, then enjoy the video. Now we're going to be going through all the champions in alphabetical order, so we will be starting with Aatrox, and I'm going to be putting him straight into A tier. However, keep in mind, I did have him A tier on the previous patch, but he has gone strong on this patch. He's gone from lower A more so to the higher end, and the reason for that, even though he didn't receive a direct buff, is because a lot of the nerfs and the removal of lethal tempo really benefit Aatrox. So the nerf to Ghost, of course, not just in lane, but in the game in general, is a lot better for Aatrox to play into, but especially a lot of Aatrox's really common matchups that you run into, popular champs like Darius, Jax, Yone, champs like Olaf, Gwen, the matchups are a lot easier for you now. Ghost being nerfed makes it really hard for champs like Darius and Olaf to burn their Ghost for your flash, and then have this massive timer where they can punish you when your flash is on cooldown. Now they only have about a 1 minute window if they stagger the timer like that, so it's a lot easier for you to play into, and a lot of champions that relied on lethal tempo, like Yone, of course, their matchup's a lot easier now, but a big one for me is Jax, because in this matchup, it's a really intensive skill matchup, I would say, but Jax really needs to get a lead between levels 1 to 5. You need to really push that advantage, because if Aatrox gets, level 5 to 7 to level 9, he's going to start dominating that Jax until Triforce, but now it's really hard without lethal tempo for Jax to force those early advantages, so I'd say a lot of Aatrox's most common matchups have gotten a lot easier for him, so he's moved up a little bit in A tier. Moving on to Akali. Now, in my opinion, this champion is quite underrated in top lane, but I am going to be putting her in B tier. I was close to putting her in A, but my reason for not doing so is she's not that versatile. You really need to be picking her in the perfect situation. You need a good matchup, and you really need to see what jungler your jungler is playing. Because if your jungler plays a champ like Lilia or Nidalee or Karthus and you're playing Akali, you're going to be very useless. Most champions you play against in top lane can build more of Mormortius or Kayn or Hollow Radiance, so you're really going to struggle to find value in the game, especially if you have an AP jungler. So you really need to be seeing Akali as an R5 on red, or maybe even, B5 on blue. If you've seen heaps of champions on the enemy team, it can work, but generally on this patch, because the XP to jungle is so overtuned at the moment, in my opinion, the AP junglers are really strong, so there's not much room for Akali. It's very rare that you find a good opportunity to pick her, but if you pick her as an R5 into a good matchup like Jax, and you have an AD jungler, you can find a lot of value in that game. Now, as for Akshan, in my opinion, he's the definition of an average range top laner, so he's going to be finding himself into B tier. He's pretty good in lane, he's pretty good at roaming, he's just solid as a range top. As long as you pick him in a good matchup, you can find success. He scales pretty decently well, not the best. So I'd say in general, he's pretty average at everything in terms of what you want a range top laner to provide. And he is kind of vulnerable. It's pretty hard to use your escape well, especially with the new terrain, especially if you verse, strong jungle champs like Rek'Sai. It can be really hard for you to find value. But especially on this patch, I'd say there's a lot of AP tops running around. It can be a bit easier to play around those ganks, but I'll just say in general it's really hard to get the most out of this champion, so generally he is a B tier pick. Moving on to Camille, and I'm going to be putting her straight into S tier. Not only did she receive a buff last patch which made her really strong, but also the removal of lethal tempo and even ghost nerf makes her even stronger on this patch, relative to all the other top laners. So she's in such a great spot right now. There's not a lot of matchups that are very difficult, and the ones that are difficult are quite hard to execute. So now Jax can't take lethal tempo, the matchup's a lot easier for you. Fiora, that champion is very hard to pilot, so you're not really going to run into any super high level Fioras until around Master Plus. So generally this champion is so good, and I would say this is a champion where it's a rare case where she's pretty much just S tier or maybe high A in every elo bracket. I think she's in such a great spot right now and a really strong pickup for most champion pools if you love playing that type of style. So I would say she's probably the best top laner on the patch right now. Now, as for Cassiopeia, this is a hard one to place. I'm going to be putting her into B tier. I think she can be a strong champion, high A in the right hands, but there's not many hands that can, pilot her quite well. So if you have a lot of experience on Cassiopeia, or maybe used to main mid, and you love control mages, but you made the swap to top, she could be a great pickup for you. This champion is very strong in lane, very good scaling, has a lot of outplay potential, and just in general, not a lot of players have experience playing against it. You need to be really good at baiting out the Q, dodging it, closing the gap when she misses Q, and punishing that short cooldown, playing around the poo set and get stuck in the W, stuff like that. She has a lot of room for outplay and a lot of room for error, so I'd say she's a really high skill cap top laner and really hard to play, so I definitely don't recommend playing her, unless if you're below the rank of, I'd say, Emerald 4. And even if you're above that, I wouldn't look to pick her up unless you're really committed for the long run. Unless you're willing to put hundreds of games onto her, or you have a lot of experience on her in the past. Like for example, if you used to main mid, you can add her to your pool. But in general, the champion is so hard to play, it's not very accessible to the general player base. So it's just something to keep in mind if you're looking to try it out. Next, we have Cho'gath, and I'm going to be putting him straight into D tier. In my opinion, regardless of your elo bracket, this is just a weak champion. He gets countered really hard by a lot of common champions that are played. Champs like Darius, really hard to play. Champs like Aatrox or Fiora. Basically, any meta top lane champion or any top lane champion with a high pick rate will run over Cho'gath in most situations. He can work, as a counter pick, but if you're 5-picking Cho on red side, countering like an Ornn or something, a good matchup for you, it's probably not going to be worth it. There are definitely going to be better picks, and the payoff is not really worth it. You're really weak in lane, you're very vulnerable to ganks, and the scaling payoff is not as big as other champions, so you might as well pick a different champ every time, where Cho'gath would look good in that situation. Moving on to Darius, and even though Ghosts did just get a pretty big nerf, especially the duration nerf is quite painful for Darius in teamfights, I'm still going to be putting him in A tier. I think this champion is very strong, especially if you pick him later on in the draft when you see a bunch of melee champs that need to be running towards you. He can work quite well. I'd say he's less versatile in this meta with jungle being OP, especially with a lot of range, AP junglers running around. It makes him less valuable. But in my opinion, Darius is almost always a champion that you should only be picking in the right situation anyway. If you see a good matchup for you, if you see melee champs that are running towards you, he has a ton of value, and that hasn't changed even with the nerf of Ghost. So I still think he's a great champion, and I'm going to be keeping him into A tier. Next, we have Dr.Mundo, and I'm going to be putting him into C tier. Now, I was close to putting him into B, because he did benefit a little bit from the item buffs, but in my opinion, this champion is quite good in lower ranks, platinum, low platinum below. He can find a lot of success, but you're really going to struggle against good players, because a lot of his counter picks also outscale him. Champs like Darius, champs like Gwen, champs like Fiora are very good against him in lane, and they outscale him. It's really, really hard to do your job in the game. Now, there are going to be games, even in high ranks, where the champion is strong, especially versus a, low damage comp, and if you're counter picking, he can definitely work. Not saying he's a trash champion, but I'd say he's not that versatile. He's a good blind pick, but if you verse good players, you're going to be more of a hindrance for your team, in my opinion. So in general, I would say this champion is still in the middle to lower end of the yellow bracket tiers, where he'll find more success, but generally he should just be a counter pick in the higher. Up next, we have Fiora, and she's going to be joining Camille up in S tier, the two queens up in S, and the reason she's in S is she's just in a really good spot right now. She's very strong in lane, especially levels 1 through 3. She scales very well, one of the best scaling tops in the game. So much outplay potential, just really strong, and a lot of her counter picks are very difficult to play. So champions like Kennen, champions like Akshan that are quite good into Fiora are really hard for, the range top laner to play. The ease of executions on them. So if you have really high level of mastery on this champion, you're going to be fine. Now, there are some really common matchups that did get a little bit better on this patch. Jax is one of them, where lethal tempo being removed feels so much easier for this matchup, because Jax has the favor in the early stages of the lane, because he can get pushed, so he can, abuse a level 2 to 1 time, a level 3 to 2, he can let the wave come back, play for jungle gap, stuff like that. But now that lethal tempo is removed, he is so much weaker, it's a lot harder for him to get pushed, especially if Fiora takes grasp and bone plating in this matchup. It's so hard for Jax to cleanly get the wave in without getting poked down and getting shit on. So I'd say Fiora really, not really benefits, but slightly benefits from this patch, but she's just in a strong spot in general. Next up, we have Gangplank, and GP's going to find himself in C tier. You might be thinking he's D tier after the, the Essence Reaper nerf. You have to build Triforce now, and he is quite weak on this patch. But if you're counterpicking him into a free matchup, you can take the buff First Strike, scale for free, get the 2 item spike level 13. You're still going to be strong, so this champion still can have value in games. And now that, bot and jungle are a bit more OP, your ulti has a bit more value, inherent value with changing the, the tides of the bot matchup. But I would say if you're blind picking this champion especially, you're really going to struggle. It's not the strongest blind on the patch by any means, and there are a lot of games where you're really going to struggle to find value and not get shit on, and your 1 item spike is a lot weaker than it was before, and your 2 item spike's weaker, so he is in a worse spot on this patch objectively. But because this champion just scales exceptionally well, and he can bully, certain matchups, he's still going to find himself around C tier, depending on your bracket. If you're in really low elo bracket, I would say he's going to be a bit worse, and he probably peaks around the middle range, high platinum around emerald, if you have really high mastery on this champion. Moving on to Garen. Now I'm going to be putting Garen in A tier. He did benefit from this patch a lot. There's one thing he doesn't like, and that is the Ghost nerf, of course, if you preferred the Phase Rush, Ghost Flash setup. But the Conqueror Garen did benefit from this patch, especially with the crit items, because the crit items are so strong on him now. Going PD and even IE now, Stridebreaker PD IE is a build a lot of the Korean Garens are going. Gives you a lot of just insane damage in the game, and even your scaling is better now that you can upgrade Berserker Greaves. So definitely Garen is in a pretty good spot right now. Now, as for Gnar, I'm going to be putting him into C tier. It's pretty hard for me to place him above C because he's just so hard to make work. He has a lot of hard matchups, not the best blind pick. It's really hard to teamfight on this champion. Coordinating your mega form with solo queue teammates is almost impossible. It's hard enough in competitive, let alone in solo queue. But this champion can definitely work as a counter pick. I'd stay away from him if you're, low platinum and below. Definitely, he's really hard champion. But if you're in, high emerald, low diamond, I'd say that's probably his sweet spot. Any higher than that, you're going to get versus players that are very good at laning. But around that tier, you can get away with getting your tier 2 boots on your first recall. You can, punish them inside. So this champion can definitely work as a counter pick into champs like Singe or champs like Tahm or Volibear that just meatballs they run towards you. You can actually get quite a big advantage. You can blow up the tower. They don't have a lot of threat, so it's hard for them to set up jungle ganks against you. So he can work as a counter pick, but I wouldn't really pick him in a different situation than that. Next up, we have Gragas, and I'm going to be putting him into A tier. This champion is an exceptionally good neutralizer. There's not a lot of picks you can pick into Gragas, where you're going to force a significant advantage. He's really strong in lane, very good at disengaging any type of meaningful trade you want to take onto him, and versus ranged champs, you have a lot of flexibility. You can take Comet, poke them down. You can take Phase Rush versus champs like Olaf, kite them out. You can take Grasp, versus Meatball Bruises. So you have so much versatility depending on your matchup, and your champ's always going to have value in the game, so I would say he finds himself into A tier. And as for Gwen, I'm also going to be putting her into A tier. Now, I did have her A tier on my previous patch tier list, but she is going to be a lot lower on the lower end of A tier than she was on that previous patch. And the reason for that, of course, the nerf to Ghost really hurts her. She was a big Ghost user, probably her favorite summoner spell, but also the buff to jungle. Jungle being really OP at the moment, in my opinion, makes champs like Karthus, champs like Nidalee, Lilia, these strong AP champions are going to be over-leveled, they do a lot of damage, and those are just champs that Gwen doesn't do very well into. Gwen really loves versing meatballs that are running towards you, so champs like Xin Zhao, champs like Sejuani, Jarvan, champs that are running at you make your job exceptionally easy on Gwen, but if you're versing over-leveled, high damage mage champs that are kiting you around, makes it really hard for you to find as much value in the game. The only reason she's still A tier, and I didn't demote her into B, is because you should only be picking Gwen as a counter pick in my opinion. Now if you love Gwen and you only want to play her, don't let me stop you, but this champion is best used as a counter pick, so if you're picking her as a counter pick, you're probably not going to pick her in a situation where she's bad. Moving on to Illaoi, who's going to be finding herself in B tier. Now, in my opinion, she didn't really benefit from this patch. You could make the argument, Lethal Temper remove, Ghost nerf, pretty good for Illaoi, but especially with the way the jungle meta is shaping up, she's not going to do that well. She doesn't really like these strong over-leveled AP champs. I guess you could argue no one does. No top laner wants to verse an over-leveled jungle, but Illaoi did really well into melee champions. They run towards you. So if she's very similar to Gwen, if champions are running at you, very easy to get all of your damage down and outplay. If champions are kiting you, hitting you from far away, when you have to rely on a max range G, very hard for you to get a lot of use out of your champion. But of course, she's around B tier. She's pretty oppressive to lane against, especially if she's getting pushed in the matchup. So in general, she is a pretty average champ, but there's a good reason you don't see her in Master Plus very often, because if you verse players that are very good at laning, you are going to get hard punished. Moving on to Irelia, and I'm going to be putting her into B tier. I will reorder her at the very end to the higher end of B, but in my opinion, she's just a better mid laner than a top laner. You can make her work, but this champion is exceptionally difficult. One of the hardest champs to make work, in my opinion, because even if you get a huge lead in your lane, even if you're really good at laning, you know all your matchups, you get a big lead, 3-0, 4-0, it's really hard to translate that lead into a win. It's really hard to translate your lead to the rest of the map. Unless your opponent's just, completely given up from having to verse a good Irelia player in lane, it's really hard to carry on this champion unless you have such high mastery onto it. So I wouldn't really put it any higher unless you are a, really good Irelia player. So if you're Master Plus and Irelia one trick, I would probably put her in A. She can work quite well, especially as a counter to, range champs like Gnar, champs like GP. You're just going to run them over. She can work quite well, of course, but I'd say this champion is so hard to make work that I wouldn't put her higher into B tier, and this patch didn't really change anything about that at all. Moving on to Jax, and I'm going to be putting Jax into A tier. He has been kicked a lot while he's down. He copped a pretty big nerf, then lethal tempo nerf, then lethal tempo removal. So he is struggling. patch after patch, but he's still Jax. If you get a lead on this champion, you're going to completely run over the game. He's still, one of the best solo queue champions of all time for top lane, and especially if you have high mastery on him and you know all the matchups, he's still going to be in a good spot. Now, I do recommend leaning more so towards Grasp and Fleet, and playing more so for a lane advantage than greeting with Conqueror, but if you're really confident in the matchup, and of course there are some matchups where Conqueror is strictly better, then you should run it, but generally if you take Grasp, it's going to be pretty similar to the last season Jax, where you'd go Grasp Sheen in your lane, and take these nice short trades, really bully your opponent, and then all in them in their low HP. That style's not going to change. Of course, your one item spike Grasp with Triforce is not as good as Grasp with Sunderer, so he's a bit weaker, but still an A tier champ, still very good in solo queue, and especially if you're really confident in your matchups, you can definitely still carry on this champion. Next up we have Jayce, and I'm going to be slotting him up into A tier. This is a really solid champion in my opinion. He's a very strong all-rounder. Very good laner, can translate that lead well into the rest of the map, good, as long as you arrive to a team fight early, he's pretty good in team fights, poke them as they come in. As long as you know how to execute this champion, he is a really strong pick, so I do recommend if you're picking him often, to blind pick Malphite and then pick Jayce. That's the only matchup that I'd say, not unplayable, but so difficult that it's not worth it, where the other counter picks, matchups like Irelia, matchups like Gragas, if you play better than them, you can still get leads in those lanes, or at the very least go even, or, worst case 10, 15 CS gap, doesn't really matter. So this champion is just really solid as an all-rounder. I do recommend staying away from him if you're in the lower elo brackets, gold and below. He's very hard to execute, but if you have high mastery on the champ, very solid in pretty much every type of game state, and he's in quite a good spot. And something else you'll notice, most of the champions we have on this list, granted they're not ordered yet, Fiora, Camille, Jax, Gwen, all these champions that are ranked quite high up, Darius, Jayce plays very well into them. He has such a good matchup into the majority of these champions, so I'd say in general he's a really strong all-rounder. Now as for K'Sante, I'm going to be putting him straight into C tier, and it does feel weird after watching MSI when he looked completely broken, but this champion, even though he's OP in pro play and very good in high elo, I don't think he's an accessible champion for all elo brackets. He's really hard to get the most out of. He's still a tank, so even if you are pretty good at him, let's say you're an Emerald 4 player, right? Let's say you're sitting in Emerald, and you get your K'Sante to an Emerald level, Emerald 3, Emerald 2, slightly above your level actually, because you put a lot of time into it. He's still not going to be the best champion you could have picked up in that bracket. Now, if you love playing him, don't let me stop you. But this champion, especially with the nerf to Ghost, he's in not a great spot for, the lower tiers. Not even the lower tiers, just most tiers that aren't high elo. So I would say in general, he's just not a great pickup. But he can work if you want to have a tank in your champ pool and you love playing champions with a lot of skill expression. Moving on to Kayle, who's also going to find herself in C tier. The removal of lethal tempo definitely hurt this champion. There are actually a lot of matchups that you could bully 1 to 3, get a really, good trade onto the level 1 with lethal tempo, then the wave will come back to you, you'll get level 4 and 5 for free. So playing in that way, you can actually win a lot of your matchups or even solo kill level 1 if your opponent disrespected you, but now you've completely lost that option. You have to go fleet, you're probably going to let them push. You can still abuse your passive in certain matchups, but you're so much weaker in the early game. You're mainly just playing to scale, and that type of playstyle is generally not good in solo queue. If you find yourself asking, by the time my lane's over, my bot lane's already lost me the game, Kayle's probably not going to be the champ for you. Because if you want to stop that type of game from happening, if you want to be the difference maker, you really need to carry the early game and explode the game. And Kayle doesn't really have many options until level 6. With Berserker Greaves, you can start winning your matchup, but then you're not really a useful champ in a skirmish or teamfight until level 11, unless you have a really fit teammate carrying you. Of course, you can ult him, but generally I'd say this champion is not going to be great for the first 15 minutes of the game, so just not a good pick in general. Moving on to Karma, who's going to be finding herself in B tier. I'd say this champion is pretty good as an autofill champ for support or maybe even mid mains, just to get by. It's pretty hard to get behind in lane on this champion, even if you verse good players, depending on the champion. If you verse a really good Irelia, something like that, you're probably going to struggle, but most melee matchups or even ranged matchups, you can just poke them down if they try to trade onto you, you can neutralize waves pretty easily, and then you just buff up, whatever teammate's strong on your team. Especially if you have a strong AD jungler, like a Zinzao or Kindred or Graves, this champion can work. But I'd say it's not a good champ to have in your pool as a main champ, and in terms of this patch, no real change to her in that aspect. Next up we have Kennen, and this time around I was so close to putting him in S tier, but I'm going to be putting him in high A, and my reasoning for this is because I believe this champion is very strong, maybe even OP, in high elo brackets. He's a great blind pick, great team fighting, does well, in the majority of games, but the issue with Kennen is in terms of, comparing him to other champs, he just doesn't have as much carry potential. You can definitely carry games on Kennen, but compare Kennen to a champ like Jax or Camille or Fiora, where if you're really fit on them, it's a lot easier to maybe not 1v5, but carry the game. You can force plays, you can, outplay side lane, stuff like that, where Kennen, you're never going to be winning through side lane. You're only going to be looking for team fights, and if your team's really far behind, and even if you won your lane, maybe you're 2-0, got 2 or 3 tower plays, it's going to be hard to hard carry it. Now, I'm not saying you can't. If you get a great Kennen ulti, of course, you're always going to be very impactful, but if you verse somebody that knows what they're doing, they're marking your flank, your whole team, your team's quite far behind, your carry potential is going to be lower, and this champion is very hard to execute in lower elo brackets, so I would say he's close to being S tier because of how good he is in the higher tiers, but I'm going to be keeping him in high A. And in terms of this patch, he didn't benefit that much from it. The nerf to Ghost, nerf to Lethal Tempo, of course, makes the other top laners worse, which makes Ken slightly better. And the Liandry's buff, I would say, the better build path is a bit nice on him. But I would say this champion has just been flying under the radar for a while now, a bit underrated. Really strong pick, so I'm going to be keeping him in high A tier. Moving on to Kled. Now I'm going to be putting Kled in B tier. He's quite a strong champ in terms of having a lot of threat, a lot of individual kill potential in your matchup, especially if you take Ignite, but he just has a lot of hard matchups. If you verse a good player playing Camille, Fiora, champs like Jax, champs like Kennen, you're really going to struggle. Most range chops can beat you, but this champion, especially if you have high mastery onto him, can catch a lot of people off guard. He has a lot of strong all-in threats. Not a lot of people know the execute range of when they can actually kill you when you fall off your horse before you can remount, so he can work quite well. And in terms of this patch, no real change there. He didn't take Ghost of Lethal Tempo. Jax losing Lethal Tempo, I guess, could benefit him slightly, but generally, he was B tier last patch, and he's going to stay the same. And as for our rock on the top, Malphite's going to find himself in A tier. This champion's just very solid, very strong in pretty much every game you play him, and there are going to be games where I would say he's a game-breaking pick. He's very busted, and games where, of course, they have full AD comp, or if you verse a mobile AD champ, so Jayce top, Quinn, AD range tops, or even AD range mids. So if you see an Akshan mid or a Jayce mid, stuff like that, the champion becomes very broken, I would say. So really strong champ to have in your pool as a counter pick, and in terms of this patch, no real changes. He does hate a lot of the AP junglers running around, but because you would only use Malphite as a counter pick in most situations, in my opinion, you're going to see what the jungle is playing, so I'd say that's not really going to change much in terms of this patch. Moving on to Mordekaiser, and Mord's going to find himself in B tier. I'll put him in the higher end of B tier at the very end, and I believe this placement is going to be very consistent across most elo brackets. If you want to nitpick, you could say in Challenger games, he might be in C tier, or in Bronze or Iron, he might be in, A or S tier, but I'd say generally he is a really solid champion, a high B placement. And my reasoning for that, in terms of this patch, he got a net benefit, because with Ghost being nerfed, it does hurt him a little bit, because in my opinion, Ghost was better on Mordekaiser than Flash, and you could even run Ghost and Flash together, but two of his most common counter picks, Darius and Olaf, also had their Ghost nerfed, which is going to benefit him, and Lethal Tempo removal means Jax and Yone matchup got a lot easier for you. So I'd say you did benefit from this patch overall, and that piece of Liandry's, Sacred Ash, whatever it's called, is a great little spike on him. But I would say he still has some hard matchups, he still has the same problems, and also on this patch with AP junglers being very powerful, you don't want to be playing Mord with like Lilia or Karthus or anything like that, of course, so he does lose a bit of value in terms of the way the jungle meta has shifted, but he's still a great champ, really solid, and a really good champ to have in your champ pool. Next up we have Nasus, who's going to be finding himself in C tier. He's got a lot of similar problems that he had in the past, and Ghost being nerfed definitely hurt him, so I would say he doesn't really change much in that aspect, slightly worse than before. He does struggle into the strong meta junglers that are popping up in this patch, so I would say he's still in, not a great spot overall, but can work, especially if you're in a matchup where you feel like you can scale for free. Moving on to Olaf, and I'm going to be putting him into A tier. Don't get me wrong, the Ghost nerf definitely hurt him. He's going to be lower in A tier than he was in the past, but he's still a great solo queue pick, especially if you're in a good matchup or you see a lot of crowd control champs, you're still going to have a lot of value in that game. So if you verse a champ like Malphite or a champ like Cassante, a matchup that's good for you, a champ like Mordekaiser, and they have CC and other aspects of their team comp, maybe they have a Nautilus or a Leona, maybe they have a champ like Zac or Sejuani jungle, your champ's still going to have a lot of value in that game, especially if you snowball. So even though Ghost did get nerfed and it did hurt him a little bit, he's still in a pretty strong spot, nowhere near as good as previous seasons. He feels a lot worse to play, but if you use him as a counter pick, he can be great, and even as a blind pick, he's not bad. A lot of your matchups you can get away with, but I don't like him as a blind pick, early on in the draft. A blind pick when you see a bunch of their champions is fine, because you will get value if you see Olaf works well into the other 3 or 4 champs, but generally you want to be picking this champion later on in the draft. Moving on to Ornn, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. This champion's just a very solid tank. you're always going to be doing your job in the game. He's not often going to be the lose condition or really the win condition. He's a great pick if you need frontline for your team. So if you have champs like Azir, champs like Jinx, especially with AD carry being a lot stronger this patch, his value goes up a little bit, but he's still Ornn in solo queue. You want to be having carry potential in solo queue if you can, but he's still great if you need to fulfill that tank role. Now, in terms of this patch, you could make the argument of lethal tempo and ghost nerfs to, help him a little bit. I'd say it didn't really help him as much as it does help other champs. He's still in a pretty similar spot in terms of how your matchups will play out. So I'd say in general, he's in a pretty similar spot, even with the buff to tank items. The buff to his passive is nice, don't get me wrong. But I would say in general, it's solo queue. You're playing this full tank champion with CC, so I wouldn't really put him higher than B. Now, as for Pantheon, he's going to be ulting straight into A tier. I played a lot of this champion recently to make the Pantheon guide, not really on this patch of course, but I would say the good thing about this champion is he works well in pretty much all elo brackets. He can work well as a, lower elo stomper champ, he's quite good in high elo, especially as a counter pick, so I'd say this champion is just very solid overall, and in terms of this patch, no real changes. The PTA buff is nice for him in a lot of his matchups, so I'd say in general, this is just a pretty similar strength to before, and just a good champ all around. Now, as for Poppy, she's going to be finding herself in B tier. She's a pretty solid champ all around, and especially if you see champs like Camille, champs like Jax as your matchup, and then the other roles, champs like Lee Sin or Alistair, of course your champ's going to be OP. But in general, this champ's just solid. You're just going to fulfill your role in the game, and because you're the main disengage for your team, and that's the main reason for picking Poppy, but it's sort of counterintuitive, because if you pick Poppy to disengage against champs like Camille, and champs, like Jackson diving onto your team, and they just push side and make you respond, then they look to attack your team, it's going to be hard to function in that game, and really, get the most out of your champ, but especially if you win your lane, because Poppy does have a pretty strong laning phase, and you actually can win the side against some early game, you can get a lot of work done, so this champion can work, and in terms of this patch, doesn't really benefit her at all. The Sunfire buff is nice, but I would say it doesn't really change her placement on a tier list. And as for Quinn, no real changes on this patch. She's going to be finding herself in B tier. Still a great counter pick to champs like Renekton, champs like Riven, champs like Sett, merely bruises that really struggle to get onto her, but she doesn't really contribute much to the game unless she gets a big lead. She's just a secondary AD carry, and you could argue that the crit changes do benefit her, which is true, and that, 2 or 3 item point, she can get a bit of value from it, but I'll just say generally this champion as a top laner should be best used as a counter pick, and being slightly better scaling doesn't really change how valuable she is in terms of the game. Moving on to Renekton, who's also going to be finding himself in B tier. He's a pretty solid champion. The reason I wouldn't put him in A these days is just because he's not as strong as he was in the past. Where on the previous seasons where you could build Gore Drinker, you were just so powerful in skirmish and teamfight situations that you could just 1v9 those Dragon and those Herald fights. And now even though Eclipse is a pretty strong first item, spike, it's a different kind of spike. You're stronger in terms of 1v1 combat power, but you're a lot squishier, a lot easier to blow up, and just weaker in skirmishes and teamfights in general. So I'll say this champion sits around B tier in terms of this patch, no real change. Lethal tempo nerf, I guess you could argue is kind of good for him. In terms of the Jax matchup, Yone matchup was already quite easy, so I'd say this champion just sits around B tier, no real changes on this patch. Moving on to Rengar, and I'm going to be putting him straight into A tier. I think this champion's very powerful, and every time I come to Korea, I do get a bit of a wake-up call, just how strong this champion really is. He's really powerful in lane, and not a lot of people play against him, so if you're a good Rengar player, you can win a lot of your matchups. Now, in terms of this patch, no real changes. He does benefit a little bit, I should say, from the lethal tempo being removed. The Jax matchup was one of his hardest. Now it's a lot easier for him. And Yone, of course, not really the hardest Rengar matchup, more of a skilly, is just, freelo now. So I'd say he does benefit slightly from this patch, but he's just a strong champ in general if you have really high level of mastery on him. Moving on to Riven, who's going to be finding herself in A tier. This champion is exceptionally strong in solo queue. Such a great pick, especially if you have really high mastery on the champion. And you probably saw last season, Viper was just dominating rank 1 NA on this champion as his main pick, his main blind pick, even though there are some hard matchups, there is some room around that. Now, don't get me wrong, this champion is a lot weaker than she was in previous seasons, but she's still a strong pick, still definitely A tier, and in terms of this patch, no real benefit there. You could argue the nerf to Ghost removal of lethal tempo, you could benefit her slightly, but generally doesn't really change much. She's still in a very similar position, still a very strong solo queue pick, and I'd put her around the middle of A tier. Next up on our list, we have Rumble, who's going to be finding himself in A tier. This champion is such a strong laner, really good blind pick, and just really good at impacting the map early game. So if you can get involved with these early skirmishes and, start to win the early game for your team, then you can be the one with the level 14 jungler and they can be the one with the level 10 one. The game is going to be a lot easier. And also that extra item that builds into Liandry's, really OP as an early spike on him, the Sacred Ash, whatever it's called. So really good patch for him, I would say. And Ghost Lethal Tempo, two things he avoided, of course, I would hope so. So really good patch for him, really strong situation. One thing I do advise is to watch out for AP junglers on your team. You don't want to be playing Rumble with champs like Carthage, champs like Nidalee. That is definitely a recipe for a 15-minute FF, but if you have an AD jungler, really great pick. Moving on to Sett, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. This champion has a very strong early lane, especially if you take Ignite, and he uses the new item very well, the Overlord's Bloodmail. Really great pickup on him, so I'd say he benefits quite a bit from this patch, so he's in a much better spot overall than he was in previous patches. Now as for Shen, I'm going to be putting Shen into C tier. I do think he increased in value on this patch, because the role strength of jungle and AD carry did increase, which means inherently top lane's value has gone down, so ulting and getting your jungle or your AD carry fed is actually more valuable. When I actually believe this season, top lane was in such a good spot, yet so much carry potential, I didn't really see the reason to play Shen, but now he does have some value in a lot of games if you can get them snowballed, of course. The problem is it's still solo queue, you're inherently relying on them, and if you ulti away, and you give a strong top lane champ like a Jax, like a Fiora, like a Camille, 2 or 3 tower plates in 3 waves, they're probably going to carry the game with that lead. So it's really important that if you play this champion, you need to be in a matchup where the cost isn't the cost isn't too high of leaving. So if you verse like a Kennen, for example, bad example, he's going to wreck you in lane. Let's say you're versing like an Ornn or a Sion, right? And you TP away. They get 2 plates and probably not going to carry the game with that lead. So it's going to be fine in certain matchups, or if you're in a counter matchup where you can get push in a Crash Wave 3, not wave 3, crash a stacked wave and then ulti away, it can be fine, especially if you ulti away TP back top, but generally it's very hard to win lane on Shen, especially as a blind pick, unless, only as a counter pick do I feel like you can realistically win your lane, unless you heavily outplay your opponent. It's just really hard to have a lot of value in this game, and even if you ult away and get your, teammates snowballed, you have to rely on them to, use that lead quite well. So I'd say in terms of a solo queue champion, not the greatest pickup. He could be high C tier, maybe even low B, depending on the bracket. Now as for Shyvana, let's not waste any time, straight into D tier, terrible lane, doesn't scale that well, and this patch doesn't change anything. Now as for Singed, I'll be putting him into C tier. He did get hit pretty hard with the Ghost nerf. I'd say he's one of the champions in League of Legends that relies on Ghost the hardest, and the, increased cooldown, reduced duration, really hurts Singed in particular, because Singed, I would say, is probably the champion that uses the full 15 seconds of Ghost, probably the best out of any champ. Pop ulti, you pop Ghost, you have as much impact as possible during that timer, but now that's way shorter, you're going to have Ghost up less often, so your bad laning phase is not going to have as much of a payoff as it did in the past, so this champion is really going to struggle on this patch. Moving on to Sion, I'm going to be putting this guy straight into C tier. Now you might be surprised because that new item does work quite well on him, the Overlord's Bloodmail, but just keep in mind, if you're the boss watcher, he is a outlier. He's the Sion guy, and generally, 99% of Sion players, this item's not going to make a difference for their success on this champion. The champion, you're not going to get that item until your second or your third item anyway, so the problem Sion has is still going to be consistent, where a lot of your matchups are hard, you're not a great blind pick, and a lot of your counter picks will just outscale you. They'll be better than you in team fights. Champs like Gwen, champs like Darius, champs like Aatrox, they win lane, they win team fights. So it's really hard for you to be a good blind pick, and you don't really want to be wasting, that valuable counter pick slot on Sion, unless it's just, your main champ. Of course, you have such high mastery on him, it makes up for, picking a better counter pick in terms of the matchup. But I'd say generally in terms of the champ, objective strength, I have to put him around C tier. Next up, we have Skarner, who's going to be living the dream up in S tier. I think this champion is quite overpowered right now. He's quite a powerful champion, quite a good blind pick. And the issue with Skarner, he does have a weak 1 to 5. So if you can get ahead of him on that point, that's going to be very good for the game. But once he gets, level 6, 7 with some tank stats and you're trying to push him in, really hard to cleanly crash or to trade with him, because he can just, flash, knock you to the wall, knock you under his tower, ult you after that. Just chain that CC together and they made it a bit easier for you to chain combo like that. So he's just a modern day Cassante, really easy for him to take you into tower, really easy for him to neutralize a lot of matchups unless you're getting a hard counter pick into him. If you're really good at a champ like TF or a champ like Darius, of course you can get a lead against him, but I'd say this champion is just very safe, very strong, very useful in a lot of games, and it's really good at punishing mistakes in the lane, so I'd say in general he is an S tier champion. Moving on to TK, and Tahm's going to find himself in B tier. I think this champion is quite average in terms of a tank. His advantage is he's quite a good neutralizer. He's quite hard to punish in lane, and if you disrespect him, he can, get 3 stacks out and ult you. But if you're somebody that knows what they're doing, how to play around the passive, how to dodge Tahm Q quite well, it's going to be pretty hard for you to get a lead, and without a lead, your champ's just a walking meatball. You don't contribute that much to the game. Now, your champ's not useless by any means. You still have value, especially if your teammates are fed. You can save them, stuff like that. But I'd say just in general, even on this patch where he gets a little bit of benefit from, the buffed tank items, I'd say still he's a middle of the pack B tier tank. Moving on to Teemo, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. He's a pretty strong lane counter pick, especially into immobile melee champs like Renekton or Sett. You can do quite well, but this champion just doesn't function that well in the mid game unless you get a lead, and especially versing over leveled AP junglers, you're really going to struggle to have value in that game. Now, you can still work, especially if you snowball, and in terms of the new patch, didn't really benefit much from it. The new jungle meta is a bit annoying from him, and also the new AP burn item is not really something you want to build on top lane Teemo, and don't play Teemo anywhere else. I just mean in general, the Liandry's or Malignus are just going to be better items on Teemo, so he didn't really benefit from this patch whatsoever. And as for Trundle, don't need to dive too much into him. He's going to be demoted into C tier because of the removal of lethal tempo. It hurts him quite a lot. And although you can take PTA in, squishy matchups or Conqueror, it's not going to be the same. You're going to have a lot less, early kill threat, a lot less 1v2 power without having lethal tempo. So he definitely gets negatively impacted by this patch quite a bit. Next on our list, we have Tryndamere, who's going to be finding himself into B tier. Now, initially, when I read the patch notes, I assumed he was going to drop a bit harder with the Ghost nerf and Lethal Tempo removal, but he's still fine. His champion is actually a lot stronger in certain matchups with taking the grass setup anyway, and he is weaker than before, don't get me wrong, but he's still a really solid champion. He's quite good in a lot of matchups. It's pretty hard to punish this guy because of how much insane amount of sustain that he has, but you will feel the Lethal Tempo and the Ghost nerfs in terms of, your all-in windows and playing for early solo kills. Moving on to Twisted Fate, and I'm going to be putting him straight into A tier. I'd say the Ghost nerf definitely hurts him, and losing crit from Shiv and Kraken is kind of annoying, but he's still a strong champion, especially as a counter pick. If you pick him in the right matchup, you're going to have a lot of value, and he's just so impactful, right? Strong lane, strong side laning, good scaling, can gank mid early. Of course, he is weaker than he was before, so he's going to be lower in the lower end of A tier, but still a really solid champion. He's just very difficult to play, and I'd stay away from him unless you're in a higher elo bracket. Next up, we have Udyr, who's going to get demoted into B tier purely because of the nerf to Ghost. Udyr was a huge fan of the Summoner spell, of course, so he's really going to feel that nerf. It's going to make him a lot harder to be as impactful, because the way I see Udyr, you really want to be carrying the early game. The first 15-20 minutes of the game, this is a champion that's really good at proxying, attacking the jungler, chasing him off his camps, ganking mid if they're playing aggressive, and not having Ghost just makes it, of course, if your Ghost is on cooldown, it's going to make that a lot more risky, and your Ghost being worse makes your, your all-in threat a lot weaker. So I'd say this champion definitely gets impacted by the nerfs of this patch. Now, as for Urgot, he's also going to find himself in B tier, just a solid champion all around. He is going to struggle into the AP strong meta junglers, but if you pick him later on in the draft in good situations, you're still going to have value in that game. Now, as for Vayne, I'm going to be demoting her into C tier. She pretty much got a triple kill in terms of nerfs, where the Ghost nerf really hurts her, Lethal Tempo being gone is bad, and Fleet even being changed so that it benefits movement speed more than healing. Is going to be very painful in a lot of matchups where, for example, if you trade onto like an even trade on champ like Aatrox or Camille, most of the time should be sustaining a lot of that back with Fleet, but now that's a bit weaker, the trades are going to benefit you a bit more, and not having Ghost Lethal Tempo, her kill threat is going to be way lower, because I don't know how you guys have experienced playing against Vayne, but when I verse a Vayne with Fleet, compared to a Vayne with Lethal Tempo, the matchup feels way easier, because with Lethal Tempo and Ghost, it feels like one missed position, she can just run you down the lane and kill you, but with Fleet, her all-in threat is significantly weaker, and you don't have to be worrying about taking extended trades. So I'd say great nerfs in terms of not having to verse Vayne anymore, so I'd be putting her in C tier, but in high elo brackets, she could bump her way back up to B, and of course, there are still going to be matchups that are very hard to play into this champion. Moving on to Viego. Now, of course, our sample size is quite low in terms of data on solo lane Viego, but as of right now, I'm going to be putting him on the lower end of B tier. I think he's quite a, below average champion in terms of top lane. You can sustain through a lot of your matchups, and you do scale quite hard, quite hard on Kraken Slayer. Kraken Slayer Sundered Sky build, quite good on him, and especially if you have a dive comp, a lot of champs on your team, they want to get stuck in and can get you resets, he can work, but I'd say he's just not the best top lane in terms of punishing your opponent, and all in all, even if you do get snowballed, it's pretty hard to press your lead, so pretty average champ overall. Next up, we have Vladimir, and he's really feeling that nerf to Ghost, so we're going to be putting him straight into C tier. Also, the AP jungle meta, really bad to play any type of AP jungler with Vladimir, something you definitely want to avoid, so he's really going to struggle in this patch in total. Now, as for Volibear, I'm going to be putting him in C tier. I just think this champion is a bit of a meatball, neutralizer in lane, doesn't scale very well, pretty hard to press your advantage. It's pretty good in the, the mid to lower elo brackets, gold to platinum, from my experience from watching a lot of my students. But generally, I'd say this champion's just not very good, and this patch doesn't really change anything. And Warwick, I'd say he's in a pretty bad state after the removal of lethal tempo. Can still make him work with PTA or grasp, but I would say being able to cheese people, not really cheese, but all in people with lethal tempo, and having a really strong level 1 was a pretty key part of this champion's success on the previous patch, so he's really going to be feeling that nerf. As for Wukong, although I do believe this champion's quite powerful in gold and below, the rest of the elo brackets he is in a pretty bad spot. I'm going to be putting him in C tier. There are not a lot of matchups where he can thrive in. Of course, if you counterpick him into Gnar or Akshan or Jayce, you can probably do quite well, but generally this champion's going to struggle and this patch doesn't really change anything. Moving on to the Win brothers. Now, if you follow any type of creator that plays Yasuo Yone, you probably know they are in a very bad spot right now. Yasuo is in D tier and Yone is in high C. Now, you might think Yone is a bit lower, and if you're in a lower elo bracket, he will be probably in D if you're platinum below, but if you still have high mastery on this champion, he's still Yone. If you do well in your lane, and you scale up to 2 items, you're going to be very strong in the game. Now, getting to that point is way harder, and your laning phase is so much weaker now, especially in top lane. I do believe in mid lane, with Fleet, you can make him work a bit more than top, but top lane Yone definitely in a bad spot right now. The only reason I have him in C is there are some good matchups where you can scale for free or even win, and once you get 2 to 3 items, of course you do come online with the stronger crit items. It's just really hard to get to that point, and it just makes him a lot worse as a champion overall. And Yasuo being D, he still has the same problems as previous seasons as a top laner. If you blind pick this champion, if there's any bruiser, Renekton, Jax, Darius, something like that, you're going to get completely destroyed. And he only really works as a niche counter to champs like TF and champs like Gnar, champions I almost never see, and elo brackets below Diamond. So I'd say he's just a bad top laner overall, and especially on this patch. Moving on to Yorick, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. I think he's in the higher end of B tier. He's in a pretty solid spot, really powerful split pusher, strong side laner. He does have a weak early lane, but if you can get past that, you're going to be a pretty impactful champ in the game, because no matter what, even if you have a bad early game, they have to keep answering you inside, or you're just going to end the game. So really easy to have impact on this champion, especially if you're good at laning. Now, this patch doesn't really change anything for him. I'd say the lethal tempo nerf helps with the Jax Yone matchup, but other than that, no real changes to him, still in a pretty solid spot overall. And last on our tier list, we have Zac, who's going to be finding himself in B tier. Pretty strong champion, he does benefit from this patch in terms of the Sunfire buff. Really good on Zac, having ability haste is so much more impactful than the extra 150 HP, so really good spot overall. There are some hard matchups if you blind pick him, but this champion is pretty hard to play against if you don't have a lot of experience. He has a lot of healing, he has a lot of all-in threat with, with ulti, and he's really powerful in team fighting, so I think this champion is quite underrated. I do believe more people should look to pick him up, especially if they love being that engager for their team getting stuck in. I think he's a great champion, really strong. There are some hard matchups you're going to have to learn, but in general, especially on this patch, in a really good spot. Alright everyone, that's it for now, and as you can see, I've rearranged all the champions on this list from left to right, strongest to weakest, so now the order matters, you can get a better idea of how strong these champions are on the patch. And as usual, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me down below, and if I forgot to add your favorite champion to this list, I apologize. Feel free to comment it. Maybe you love playing top lane Corki or top lane Ivan's your main. Feel free to ask me, and if the champion's not too ridiculous, I'll see what I can do, but other than that, I'll see you guys next time.